right, AP2, time to start your video. So we're starting with Chapter 18, and the reason for that is we're going to skip Chapter 17. We're going to come back to that one at the end of the semester, and the reason for that is Chapter 17 is on hormones, and once we finish through the rest of our organ systems, we'll come back to Chapter 17, and that way it'll be more of a review chapter than a chapter you're actually having to learn. So we'll come back to Chapter 17, so let's go ahead and start with Chapter 18, which begins our circulatory system with the heart and blood vessels. Okay, so the first part, we're just going to focus on the blood itself. So looking at your major parts of your circulatory system, the different properties of blood, the blood plasma, so the liquid portion, what makes blood have its thickness or its viscosity, and how blood is produced. So depending on your focus, your circulatory system is your heart, the blood vessels, and the blood inside your blood vessels, versus your cardiovascular system is just the heart and the blood vessels, taking the blood out of it. So if you've ever gone to a hematologist, that is a person who focuses on the study of blood. So functions of our circulatory system, so transport, so within the blood, and we'll talk about this later, dealing with our respiratory system, so dropping off oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide, dealing with our digestive system, dropping off nutrients, and then also picking up waste and circulating, for example, hormones throughout the body. Helps with our immune system, so that one is the next section, actually, Chapter 21, 22, something to that effect. And then just helps with our body's regulation, dealing with fluid transfers between the blood. Okay, so in our blood, and you've covered this a little bit in Chapter 5 with our tissues. So we have our two parts of our blood. You have your plasma, which is your matrix or all the fluid stuff in the blood. And then the formed elements, which are your blood cells. So we have our red blood cells, and these are two types of our white blood cells. And then we also have cell fragments known as platelets, which are for helping with clotting as well as other things. Okay, so focusing on our study guide. So our first question, what are the 7 formed elements of the blood? So let's start with number 1, that's our erythrocytes, those are red blood cells. Number 2, platelets, so the cell fragments. And then we have 5 types of white blood cells, and you do need to know all 5 of them and their names. There will be a Connect lab where you identify them as well. So, and in the immune system, you'll actually look at each individual one's function. So you do need to know all 5 names this semester. So we have 2 different categories under our leukocytes, so our white blood cells. Those are our neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. So again, we'll learn later about what they do for our Chapter 21. Okay, so number 2, being more explicit just in case, the 5 types of white blood cells, and again, it's these in yellow. Hematocrit, okay. So one way of remembering our 5 white blood cells is never let monkeys eat bananas. So neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So a way to kind of remember them. And they all have their different way of looking, but we're going to focus that, I believe, more so on Chapter 21. Okay, so speaking of the Connect lab. So in the lab, you'll actually look at identifying the different types of white blood cells. And you'll have different characteristics. For example, the eosinophils are very orange in color, so all the little granules in it give it an orange hue. Some of them have multiple lobes with their structure. Some just have big one lobe that might be C-shaped, so you will identify them. There is a trick on that lab. There is a portion where you will count the cells. So you'll have a blood slide, and then you'll go up and down and count the different types of white blood cells. However, with that lab, I personally don't think the magnification is strong enough for you to be able to really tell the distinction between some of them. And so for the other parts of the lab, go ahead and identify, do what you do, because it's going to be easy to do the identification because they're nice and large. However, when you get to the microscope section, go ahead and prepare your slide. Go ahead and zoom in and do all that for as if you're going to do it. And then just have to go through the different squares. So you'll have a little grid at the bottom, and then you'll have to go through all the little squares to show that it looks like you actually counted. However, don't count, because again, the magnification really needs to be at 100x so you can see it. I think it's too difficult at 40x. So this is where you get to do the math. Later on, I believe in either this chapter or later somewhere, it actually has different percentages for the different amounts. So we have our 5 different elements. They are in different amounts in our blood. And so calculate based off of percentages. So I think you're supposed to count up to 50 of them. So they're going to be a percentage of those 50. So for some of the smaller ones, you're only going to have like 1, 2, and maybe 3 of the bottom 3 categories, and then calculate the other 2. Yeah, it's not zoomed in enough where I think that's a fair part of the assignment. So that's why I tell you to cheat on it. Okay, let's keep going. I have no clue why I crossed that out. Okay, so with our blood, and I'm going to have to go back on this. So in order to look at our different parts of the blood, sometimes you'll take a sample and then you'll centrifuge it. Pause. Okay, I remember what it is. I was supposed to remove this because they did the labs a little differently and they broke everything up. Don't exactly remember if there's a centrifuge anymore, but when you're in a lab, for those that will be doing lab stuff, you take a sample. So here is our sample, except for it's been already split up. You put it in what's called a centrifuge. So that's this machine right here. It's going to spin really, really fast, fast enough where if it is not balanced, so an even amount on both sides, it can start to wobble, and I have heard that it can go through a cement brick wall. So that's because how fast it's going, eventually the wobble got bad enough and it went through the wall. Okay. So when it spins it, what it's going to do is going to cause the blood to separate out into its 3 different layers. So the heaviest stuff goes to the bottom, the lighter liquid plasma is at top. So you end up with 3 layers. Your red blood cells at the bottom, the middle layer is your white blood cells and platelets, so they're not as heavy. And then lastly, your plasma at the top, which is liquid, and so therefore the lighter layer. So what that ends up is with called your hematocrit, which is basically separating the blood into its different separate components. So, number 3, what is hematocrit? There it is. And what are the 3 layers? So our erythrocytes, buffy coat, which is our white blood cells and platelets, and then plasma, and where they're located. So red blood cells at the bottom, our leukocytes and platelets in the middle, and then plasma up top. Okay, so let's look at the plasma again. This is the liquid portion of blood and what's in it. So we have proteins, we have nitrogenous compounds. So this is partially, for example, like amino acids that have to get traveled somewhere else. They do have nitrogen in them. Our different nutrients, that's how we get it from our digestive system to the rest of everything else. Dissolved gases, transporting our, for example, oxygen to our tissues, carbon dioxide away from our tissues, and then different electrolytes, all your different salts and ions and whatnot. Okay, so we have 3 different plasma proteins. Question number, where are we? Number 4. Okay, so we got our albumins. So these are made by your liver, and basically they just help keep the blood, giving its thickness. Helps with our blood pressure. So we will talk about this later. You actually do need a certain amount of blood pressure to actually get your nutrients to the tissue. The next type are your globulins. We'll talk about them more in chapter 21. These are your antibodies against a disease. So for example, right now the COVID vaccine is being distributed, and what it's doing is it gives it just a little piece of the virus, not the whole thing. It won't get you sick. The point is just to get a reaction out of your immune system, so they make these suckers right here. So what they're going to do is they're going to have certain cells, their job is only to make those antibodies, and it's going to build up that response. So just in case you do actually contract COVID, then your body already has a defense against it. So those antibodies will like bind to the virus and help keep it from entering into your cells and turning your cells into a virus factory. So helping to hopefully prevent an infection. And even if you do, because you maybe just didn't build up a good enough response, or you haven't got the second shot for whichever one is the one that you have to have 2 shots, it still helps you not have as much of a infection if you do actually get infected with COVID. Okay, and the last one is fibrinogen. It helps with forming your blood clots, so helping these little strands of proteins help with linking together with platelets and then just making everything a nice, good, sticky shield. Okay, again, they're formed by the liver. By the end of this semester, you'll get tired of hearing what the liver does. Okay, so just other stuff in the plasma. So we have nitrogenous compounds, so different amino acids for making protein, different waste, we'll talk about that later. Different nutrients, so getting those to the cells. Same thing with your gases and your different ions. Not on the test, so I'm going to skip it. Okay, so with your blood, it is thick, of course, a lot thicker than water. And that's because of those proteins we just talked about. So it gives it a thickness. It helps with it being able to flow, so having a good enough blood pressure, and allowing it to do part of that exchange with the tissues. And again, we'll talk about that later, because we'll actually do with like actually calculating that. I'll show you step by step, and we'll actually do a practice on it as well. But the thickness of blood actually helps with its function. So with our osmolarity of the blood, we do want to make sure that you are sufficiently hydrated. So making sure you're drinking your water, making sure, again, because if you get dehydrated, your blood can become too thick and then you end up having problems. So here's the problems. So for number 5, what happens if blood osmolarity is too low, high or too low? So let's start with too high. So this means there's too much stuff inside your blood. So if you remember from chapter 2, dealing with osmosis, water's going to go where it has a higher osmolarity. So it goes up a osmolarity gradient. So if there's too much stuff in your blood because let's say you're dehydrated, water's going to be taken from your tissues into your blood vessels. Now your blood vessels are only so big. So that's going to cause an increase in blood pressure because all this water coming in is going to increase the volume in this small area. And that's going to push up against your blood vessel walls, increasing your blood pressure, which can either damage your damage the actual blood vessel walls, or it could eventually end of having like actually waste being pushed out into your tissue. So back where we were trying to pick it up from. Opposite situation, if the blood pressure is too low, so not enough stuff, maybe for whatever reason, your liver stops functioning and doesn't make those plasma proteins like it normally has, so not enough stuff here. The water actually gets transferred from your blood vessels out towards the tissue. So that means that you're not picking up from the tissues what you need to. So that's going to cause a loss of blood pressure. So again, there's only so much, there's a certain amount of volume. There's not enough of blood pushing against your blood vessel walls. And so your blood pressure drops. So you're not getting nutrients to those tissues like you normally would. You also can lead to edema. So that's just a fancy word of saying swelling. So now you got all this fluid in your tissues and then you get all puffy And that ends up pressing up against nerves, pressing up your tissues, and possibly causing damage. So in order to achieve that, you regulate your sodium levels, so how many ions are in your blood, certain levels of proteins, as well as levels of blood cells. So for example, your spleen, which is another organ we'll talk about in the immune system, actually can transfer plasma as well as blood cells, both red and white, to or from your bloodstream. That also helps to regulate your fluid inside your circulatory system. Okay, where are we? Okay, creation of blood. Okay, so number 6, define hematopoiesis. What do they produce? And which one produces all 7 of our formed elements? So in order to create our red blood cells, since they don't go through mitosis, they have to be produced in certain tissues. So there's different tissues that make them, depending on where we are in development. Either the yolk sac, the liver, the spleen helps with that. But the one that makes all 7 of them is your red bone marrow. So again, for adults, those are only located in certain areas. But again, that yellow marrow can be transferred back to red just in case you need more red blood cells being made. Okay, so red bone marrow, that is where all 7 formed elements of the blood are created. So your white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. You don't have to know all this stuff right here. This is just the extra details. They start off as a differentiated type of stem cells, and they go through their own process of becoming their own different types. And we're going to stop the video here and then pick up next time.